So I recently got a new camera, the A7S III, as many of you saw, and per usual, a lot of you had questions like, what was wrong with the last camera, and why did you get this camera, and what's up with this camera, and do you still use this camera, and when should I upgrade my camera? All pretty valid questions. What you need to realize though is regardless of how many cameras you see me buy on a regular basis, I go through a pretty thorough checklist that helps me really determine if I actually need to buy a camera or not. And I hope my internal checklist can help you as well. Here's how I process it. The first question I always ask myself is, what is this camera going to be used for? What's the main purpose of this camera? For me, for example, if it was going to be a camera that I'm going to be using for YouTube, then what type of content do I plan to create on YouTube? This doesn't have to do with image quality or even color. It has to do usually with the functionality of what the purpose is. The second thing I ask myself is, based on what I just said I wanted to use the camera for, what limitation does my camera have now that doesn't allow me to utilize it the way that I really would prefer for that type of content? So all of the initial vlogs I used to create on YouTube, I used to use my GH5 for because those were the cameras that I had with me, so why buy a new camera? But I quickly realized there were a lot of things for this type of environment that I didn't love about the GH5. The biggest one being autofocus. I wanted to have a camera that I could point to myself and it would always grab focus and not have any issues whatsoever. So I knew I wanted to solve that problem. So I went ahead and got a different camera that would really help solve that problem. But in this next phase that I'm at now, where I'm creating a lot more content that is not just for YouTube, but it's long form content, meetings and keynotes and presentations and whatever it is, I like a camera that obviously I can hit record and let it record the entire time and not have to worry about obviously pressing the record button every 30 minutes or having any sort of limitation with the recording time. So the GH5 had that, but it didn't have the autofocus. And then I went to a different camera, which was the Canon EOS R, and that had great autofocus, but not unlimited recording time. So I still didn't solve the issue I was trying to fix ultimately. But when I got the EOS R, the long form content wasn't something I was focusing on as much as I am now. So when I decided to go with a new camera, I wanted a camera that hit three major things: great autofocus, unlimited recording time, and great low light, because I don't usually light the things that I do on YouTube or specifically for the content that I create for myself. Now here's where it gets tricky. The third thing you really have to balance is, what am I willing to give up to get what I'm actually going to improve based on that feature set? Every camera has pros and cons. There is not a perfect camera at all, even though the A7S III kind of does feel like a perfect camera. When I went from the GH5 to the EOS R, I gained great autofocus but lost the unlimited recording time. At the time, I was totally fine losing the unlimited recording time because that wasn't that big of a factor for what I was going to create with it. I also lost things like 4K 60 in the GH5 to only 4K 30 frames a second or 24 frames a second in the EOS R, but those things weren't important for the type of content I was going to create. So once I've decided what type of content I'm going to create with the camera, what camera makes sense to create that kind of content, and what do I have to give up for the new camera that the old camera might have had that the new one doesn't. If all those questions are answered, the fourth one is kind of the easiest, but it's still pretty important. Does the investment that I'm about to make in that camera justify the reason that I'm even getting it? Let's say, for example, you had a camera that did everything you possibly wanted and it was $1,000, but you really wanted autofocus, for example, and the camera that checks all those other boxes except for autofocus exists, but it's $5,000. Does the $4,000 difference in price justify you getting rid of the camera you have to get something more? If there are still things that you have to give up just to get those. Sometimes it's more than just can you afford it, it doesn't make the most sense for you. And for all those reasons, it's why I chose the A7S III. All the things that I need in a camera that I carry with me all the time. This was the first camera I think I've ever found up until this time that checks every single one of those boxes, that in my opinion, regardless of what the camera costs, it was worth the investment for me because it allowed me to have no excuses to create all of the type of content I wanted to create. The A7S III is not a perfect camera, but it's a perfect camera for what I want to create with it. And I think the problem is most people, when they buy new gear, They don't have any sort of internal checklist. They simply look at a piece of gear and say, that looks amazing, my camera's crap, and I need to get rid of it because everyone else is getting the best new camera. And just because it's the best new camera that has all these crazy specs doesn't mean it's important for you. Don't chase new cameras and new gear just because new cameras and new gear come out. Run through that checklist and decide if you actually need to invest in it or if you're just looking at it as an excuse to spend money or not create with what you already have.